This is Human Warnings. This will be a ramble, and if you don't like the deep end, then go back to the shallow end. So here's my overview of Rameau's Treatise on Harmony. Okay, so it was published in 1722. I think first I have to say that this is the first of four that I'm going to do. This is on Rameau, the next one's going to be on Fuchs, the next one's going to be on C.P.E Bach, and then the last one's going to be on Schenker. It's important to say this because you need to know when these things were written and what was going on at the time. 1722 was kind of around the time when Bach was 30 or something, 27. Music still hadn't reached the perfection of the Baroque age. Music theory was still, they were developing from Gregorian chant, so it was still primitive, so this was kind of groundbreaking at the time. This was the first of its kind. Aside from Fuchs, which his book came out around the same time, I'm imagining. Now, what's important about this book, it was written by a French man, and what it did was it allowed everybody to write music, or basically took away all of the nuances and subtleties in music, and just said, okay, it's all just two chords, so don't worry about it, and do whatever you want. Now, I'm not an expert in this, so maybe I could be wrong about some of this, but I doubt it. Comment if I am. Basically, Rameau was the first asshole who came along and allowed every idiot to write music. Before, it used to be you'd have to, Rousseau said, I'll find the quote later, hopefully. Rousseau, who hated Rameau, said, let's see if I can pull up the picture. I can't find the quote, but Rousseau said that what used to take a person 10 years to become a great composer, now somebody can do it in 2 months because of Rameau. He is the reason, in my opinion, he's the first of the people who are the reason why you'll see a shitty guitar player in a nightclub or in a bar who only knows one chord and thinks that he's Jimi Hendrix. Right? Now, that's how it works now. Any idiot learns 2 chords, and all of a sudden they think that they're the greatest genius, musical genius ever. Whereas Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, all the best ones, they did not learn Rameau. They hated this asshole. They disagreed fundamentally with what this guy had to say. Brahms, in fact, said that he came around in the 1800s, so he was way after this. After this book had become established as being the way to teach music theory, Brahms said that he had to unlearn everything that he learned in order to write correctly, and I think he was referring to this bullshit. So this book, Harmony, it neglects all ideas of horizontal development and how chords need to resolve and they need to be they need to be prepared. It's almost like the equivalent of a book on how to write a Hollywood screenplay, where it's don't worry about any nuances, don't worry about any having any depth in your story, just have a cliffhanger here and that's basically what this asshole did. Now, I read the book and I took notes. I don't remember most of it, but one thing I do remember, I think, was that he said there's only one dissonance, and that's the 7th. And it makes sense. It's a good argument, I guess. It's just that there's more to it. You don't just learn that and then all of a sudden you're done with your music education. But unfortunately, I think a lot of the composers, the shitty ones like Wagner or what's his name, Stravinsky, all those assholes, everybody from from the Romantic period, I think this was their only education, was just the most basic crap, and then they just went on. And if you listen to their music, you see that there's no nuances or subtlety. I found one quote by Rousseau. Rousseau, the only thing I know about him is he's a French philosopher, and he never named any of his kids until they turned 6 because of the infant mortality. He didn't want to get close to them. Rousseau said, I devoured my treatise on harmony, but it was so long, so diffuse, and so badly arranged that I felt it would take me a considerable time to study and disentangle it. And the translator says, personal malice entered into Rousseau's judgment, to be sure, for Rameau and Rousseau were bitter enemies, but the statement contains more than a modicum of truth. That quote doesn't really apply or anything. I just like to hear anything negative about Rameau. I think this asshole was also the first to think of the idea of inversions as opposed to just a sixth chord being a sixth chord in and of itself. What's important about this is that if you just think about a chord in terms of its inversions, you tend to forget of the importance and the purpose of the inversion. I'm sorry to anybody who doesn't know music theory. A sixth chord or a 6/4 chord have all sorts of characteristics that one ought to know. But because of Rameau, we just have inversions and nobody thinks anything more than that. Which makes a person's music a lot more blunt, coarse, ignorant. Also, a big thing is that Rameau thought that a fourth interval, the interval of a fourth, was not a dissonance. And that is something that Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms all disagreed with. And Fuchs, of course, who wrote the book that I'm going to talk about. And Schenker, who wrote the book that I'm going to talk about. And C.P.E Bach, who wrote the book that I'm going to talk about. I mean, that's kind of the big thing here, I think. His idea that the fourth is not a dissonance. Now, the reason, according to Fuchs and C.P.E Bach and Mozart and Brahms, the reason that the fourth is a dissonance is because it's ambiguous as to what's going on. And that ambiguity can be used, but it should be used in terms of being a dissonance, not... Anyways, it's too much to get into right here, but generally Bach and Mozart and all of them, they believe that a fourth is a dissonance that resolves to a third. Okay, now I'm reading a quote about Rameau from the introduction to Schenker's Harmony book. Rameau's concept was much too narrow. Rameau's great error was to interpret harmonically or vertically a bass that was composed horizontally, according to contrapuntal principles. The possibility of Auskomponierung was totally overlooked. Oh, that word is just a Schenkerian word from the Schenker, the fourth book I'm going to talk about. It's just an idea of unfolding of a melody. Rameau's theory was introduced into Germany by Marburg. He was a certain theorist. I think you get the gist of this overview being that this guy's a real piece of shit and he screwed music up forever. But I just found some quotes about him, so I'll just read some stuff. And this is all from the introduction to Schenker's book on harmony. Okay, Bach and his circle of friends remained completely negative towards Rameau, obviously. Emanuel Bach wrote to Kernberger, who was a faithful pupil of Sebastian Bach, and at the time engaged in a controversy with Marburg. Quote, "You may announce it publicly that my father's principles and my own are anti-Rameau." Kernberger himself, in the True Principles of Harmonic Practice, has the following passage, quote, "Rameau has stuffed his theory with so many inconsistencies that I am just wondering how it could have come to pass that there are Germans who fall for it and even fight for it." Oh, and by the way, I'm pretty sure that all the conservatories of music in this day and age are teaching theories that Rameau came up with, that Bach and Mozart and all of them did not agree with. Like, all the great genius composers hate this theory, and all the mediocre composers love it. What does that tell you? I'll tell you what it told me. It told me that if I can learn the real shit, the shit that Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven and Brahms learned, I could actually write genius shit. Okay, so Kernberger writes, Rameau himself has not grasped the simplicity of harmony in its true purity, for he occasionally mistakes passing notes for fundamental ones, which I kind of alluded to with the unfolding and whatnot. Oh, here's that great quote by Rousseau. I love it. The study, quote, the study of composition, which used to require about 20 years, now can be completed in a couple of months. Musicians are devouring the theories of Rameau, and the number of students has multiplied. France has been inundated by bad music and bad musicians. Everybody thinks he has understood the finesses of art before having learned as much as the rudiments. Okay, well, now I'm going to read some quotes about Fuchs, who I'm going to be doing next. So I guess these four overviews that I'm doing are going to leak into each other. I'm going to say some things about Fuchs here, and I won't be saying them in the Fuchs overview. Haydn, he taught Mozart. He was a good guy. He said of C.P.E Bach, C.P.E Bach being the one who wrote the book that I'm going to be doing after Fuchs, that he owed him everything. The next book I'm going to read, Fuchs and Bach, C.P.E Bach's book, were the foundations of Haydn's own teaching, and later also of Beethoven's. I found the Brahms quote. Brahms had already complained that before being able to do anything constructive himself, he had to first unlearn everything he had learned. Okay, I'm just going to keep reading, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to go from place to place. Composers began to think only vertically, and to write accordingly. The great ones among them were fully aware of this danger. In his critique of the Waverley Overture by Berlioz, what an asshole, Schumann wrote, "Often it is only a series of empty sound effects, of lumps of chords thrown together, that seem to determine the character of the piece." Chopin told a friend of his, "It has become customary now to learn chords ahead of counterpoint, which means ahead of the sequences of notes by which the chords are formed. Berlioz simply sets down the chords and fills the interstices as best he can. By also reducing merely passing chords to fundamental chords, Rameau destroyed all continuity." He reduced all chords to tonic, dominant, or subdominant. It overlooked the possibility that identical chords have different meanings according to the context in which they move. Likewise, it could not lead very far because it applied only to the relations between two neighboring chords. It could never bring about a synthesis of the whole. So that's basically it. Conclusions. Rameau was basically like a grade school teacher of music theory, and nobody learned anything more complex than that, and that's why I think he's one of the people that made music as primitive as it is today. His main ideas that still carry forward, I think, are that the fourth is not a dissonance, that inversions are just inversions. They're not looked at in terms of the way what they're there for, what they can do, what they lead to, where they come from. For example, a 6/4 chord will resolve into something. It's not just a chord that you just put there. And I do remember, it's pretty interesting, his idea that the seventh is the only dissonance. That was interesting. I don't really agree with it, but it was interesting. I remember part of the idea of the seventh being the only dissonance was that I think the seventh creates a tritone between the third and the seventh. So again, the seventh creates the dissonance. And he explains how every single dissonance comes from that. If you like gays, click like. If you like blacks, comment. If you like women, click notification bell. If you like gay women, subscribe. And if you like gay black women, Patreon, Human Warnings, give me money.